Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's October 2021, and you're listening to episode 258, which is a conversation about African traditional religion. Today's guest is Ann Kennedy, who has an MDiv and is the author of Nailed It, 365 Readings for Angry or Worn-Out People. Ann blogs about current events and theological trends at Preventing Grace on patheos.com. Ann has written a feature article in the print edition of the Christian Research Journal, Volume 44, Number 3. Her article is called African Traditional Religion, Black Lives Matter, and the Prosperity Gospel. Our subscribers can read Ann's article for free at our website, equip.org. If you would like to read this feature article and are not currently a subscriber, please go to equip.org to subscribe to the journal. Ann, it's good to have you on.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, this particular topic is very interesting because not only does it have, we're talking about traditional African religions, obviously roots in Africa, but your article also talks about how some of that has been exported to the West. But I think one of the biggest questions maybe people would be asking themselves is, Ann is a Caucasian woman, and so what is her connection to traditional African religions at all? Is it just an academic interest that you have?
Well, it is partly academic. When I researched this topic for the Harvest Handbook of World Religions, and it was one of the most exciting intellectual pursuits of the last 5 years for me. I had such an amazing time reading about this. But I think my initial interest, of course, is because my parents are still with Wycliffe Bible translators, and I grew up as a very young child into my teens in high school in a small village in West Africa in Mali. And my dad was leading up the team that developed an alphabet, and he wrote a grammar of this language. And my mom did anthropology, and they now have the scriptures in that language in the place where I grew up. And so I grew up living in a world where most people would self-identify maybe as an African traditionalist. They believed and ordered their world in the way that I tried to describe in my article and chapter. And so I have an emotional connection, and I think an emotional resonance with people who think and believe this way. And it's a wonderful, if you like world religions, it's one of the best and most interesting world religions of the world. So yes, I don't really, in a world where you're supposed to have quote lived experience about something in order to be able to talk about it. I'm not an African traditionalist. I'm not African. I'm not a white person. But the home of my heart is a place where people think and believe in terms of the categories that I describe.
Now, when you were growing up, did you experience people actually practicing African traditional religion?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, some of the biggest cultural misunderstandings that I endured as a child were religious ones. So, everybody, even Christians, are so formed and shaped by the culture in which they're in that they will filter, Christian teaching through the grid that they have. Of course, we in the West do that as well. But one sort of terrible, fun, but terrible thing. We, as Westerners, wanted one day to go and have a picnic. So we packed up our picnic and we went to be beside a stream, a nice water. Westerners like water and they like to eat food outside, which is kind of insane in a very hot climate. So we were having our lunch. And later we realized that everybody assumed that we were sacrificing to the jinns of that stream. Of course we would be. Why else would you go and sit beside water and eat food? There is no other reason. So things like that were, very common day to day in my childhood, those kinds of misunderstandings. But then, the people I know who live there still, even some Christians, are so shaped by this that they're surprised, when they encounter Christian doctrine that's at odds with their worldview. Like, for instance, you shouldn't get married in a church if you're not chaste before marriage, because some spirit or other will keep you from having children after your marriage. So everybody gets married next to the church, under the big tree. So it's so embedded. Your worldview is so embedded that it's a cultural clash all the time, which I think is wonderful and interesting, but is also disorienting.
Well, I want to back up a little bit and ask you to give our listeners a good working definition or a description of what African traditional religion is.
Well, it's a hard thing to define, of course, because it's so broad, but African traditional religion, it's the religions practiced across Africa that are pre-Christian, pre-Islamic, although, you really can't separate everything out neatly. But it's basically the worldviews and philosophies and beliefs about God, but in anthropology, the spiritual realm, human nature, who God is, and how the world came into being, what happens after you die. It answers all of the basic questions that you would expect a religion to answer. But it's not one thing. If you were going to study ATR, you would want to hopefully read a text that would show you many, many different cultural contexts, because there are some big generalizations that you can make, but each language group has their own expression of ATR. And then, it morphs and changes when have a lot of people that move to the big city. They'll take their religious worldview with them, and then it'll be shaped by other people's and sort of, continue to change. So it's very dynamic, but it is possible to describe African traditional religion. And that's what people mean by ATR. It's basically all the religions across Africa that happened before Christianity and Islam took root.
So you're mentioning that, obviously Africa is a big continent and there's 54 nations in it. So can you really say that ATR applies, if there's nuances of different ones or the different people groups, is there something that's common to all of these different nations in their traditional religions?
There are some big themes that emerge that are shared across the continent. I think first one would be that there's no such thing as an African atheist in terms of ATR. You may encounter somebody who doesn't talk about God per se much, but that person would believe in a kind of God. So most religions across Africa have an immense diversity in how they express their worldview, but most would, for instance, believe that there is a God. In the word for sky and the word for God are often similar or very closely connected. Certainly where I grew up, the word for God and the word for sky are the same. So there's a God, and he is related to creation. He did create the world, but there's been a great rupture, and how that is expressed is fascinating. There's many, many different cultures have an explanation for how God became disconnected from his creation and went up to live in the sky. For instance, in my culture, the woman that he created was irritated with him, and so sky was very close, and she poked the sky with her pestle, and then he got angry and retreated a little bit, and so she climbed on a chair and poked him again, and he retreated, and she went up on her roof and poked him again, and he said, I'm gonna go away now. I'm not going to be here anymore. So there are myths like that in most African cultures that explain how it was that God went away. And then most cultures share a knowledge of the spirit world, the intermediate spiritual beings that help mediate between humanity and God so that you can get what you need from God. God is the person who gives the rain and gives children, but you usually have to do something in order to get him to be willing to give those gifts. And so there's the idea of a fall, and there's not a Western idea, but there are ideas of transgression and of sin. And then there are, most cultures have a very robust and interesting view of what happens next in the afterlife. And there's a lot of resonance across Africa about what those, there's many, many similarities. You would be able to read about one culture's ideas about that and then go over and read about another one and see that they probably had a very similar source, at least in the beginning, and that they are being expressed in very different and varied ways.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I have a reminder for you. We'd really be grateful if you could help us out by rating and reviewing the Postmodern Realities podcast at Apple Podcasts. We would like to reach 100 reviews by the end of 2021, and anyone who writes us a short 1 to 2 sentence review of the podcast is entered in to win a free subscription to the Christian Research Journal. If you're already a subscriber, you can give that as a gift subscription to someone. And the odds for you are very good because so far only one person has posted a written review since July 1st, which is the date that we started this contest. So please head on over there. I know there are many hundreds, if not thousands of people out there listening to this podcast. We'd really be grateful because more people can find this podcast if you help us out by rating or reviewing us. And we'd also like to let you know that you can subscribe to our journal for $33.50 at our website, equip.org. And if that's not in your budget, you can go on to the website, go to magazine at the drop down, go to Postmodern Realities at any one of the landing pages for these episodes. You will find a link where you could give us a tip to help us out. Your tips help us to meet our budget, and it's through our budget that we are able to remunerate our wonderful writers like Ann Kennedy, who is worth the money that we invest in her articles. And so please help us out by supporting this magazine through your subscription or through your tips. But really, a big way you can help us out is simply tell a friend, tell people about this podcast. And you can do that very easily by posting your favorite podcast episodes on your social media feed to share it with your friends. And so now we're going back to talking to Anne in this episode about African traditional religions, to read her article, African Traditional Religion, Black Lives Matter, and the Prosperity Gospel, for free at our website, equip.org. You do need to be a subscriber. You were saying a few moments ago that there isn't really such a thing as an African atheist. So what is the traditional African view of God, generally speaking? I mean, is it like other cultures in the East where it's polytheistic, or do they basically have a similar kind of origin story with different names?
It's not polytheistic. There are not many gods. There is one God, and then there's a spiritual realm that one writer described as in terms of holism. So God and his creation are deeply connected to each other, but how you experience that is going to be not what you'd expect, not a direct line from, the human person to God. God manifests himself or shows who he is through this spiritual realm. Everything's connected. So it might look like, for instance, you were worshiping a spirit or a jinn if you were offering a sacrifice by a stream, if you were sacrificing a chicken or something. But that jinn is really closely connected to God in a bigger sense. And so he's able to bring about whatever it is that you want through this intermediary state. I've read in America, there in sort of New Age worship, that there's, as above, so below. whatever is happening for God, you can manifest it and bring it down to the physical realm here that we can see. But many people say that for Africa, it's as below, so above, that God is so well known, although you can't see him based on what you can see down here. It's so physical and so real that it's sort of an opposite way of thinking about it as sort of American New Ageism. But there's a similar idea that God, it's not a pantheon of gods. God is in himself a being, but your relationship to him is mediated very much by this unseen realm here.
So what do they think about, like, do they have a view of human anthropology? What is their belief about the human person?
Well, so the human person is deeply connected to creation. You're not an individual in any recognizable sense to a Westerner. You are bound to your community in a spiritual way from before your birth. It may be that the unseen spirit realm, the ancestors and spirits, gave you into the world, to your family, and you have obligations to the cosmos in a spiritual way that a Westerner would not understand, I don't think, at least not in an emotional way. There's no individual person. And so the rupture that happened between humanity and God isn't felt in a individual guilt kind of way. When a transgression happens between one set of people or one person and another person, they would not go and just repair that on their own. They would know that they would have to rely on the spiritual realm, which is part of the human community, in order to repair something that was broken. So the human person is connected to the family, to the place where you live. That's all the spirits that live around you or your ancestors. You wouldn't just get up and go away and have no obligations and no connection to the ancestors of that place or in the spiritual community that you have. And your connection to God is also in that way necessarily bound to your human community. You can't just go and decide to believe something or, move to another far city and take up Buddhism. You might decide to do that, but it would be a very, very strange thing to do. Your life and your obligations as a human are given to you by your community. And so there's a lot of cross-cultural trouble that can be had, especially if you're a Christian coming into a culture like that. You think, well, everybody can just decide to believe in Jesus, or if I spread the gospel, this person can be saved. The people that you're talking to are not going to have the category that you have at all in terms of who God is and who they are in relation to him at all.
So you mentioned a few minutes ago that they have a specific view of the afterlife and ancestors. Do they do similar things with regard to the ancestors as other, like, Eastern cultures that will, worship their ancestors or have, different kinds of shrines set up around in the home to ancestors in terms of, honoring the dead and praying to them?
I'm sure there are some similarities. I'm not exactly sure because I don't know very much about Eastern religions, but an African traditionalist would probably not have a shrine, a personal shrine to an ancestor where they would, leave flowers or pray, even, not in a sense that we would understand. But they would have a deep sense of obligation and connection to the ancestors. So they might have something, in the corner of your cooking hut, you may have a little place where you might pour out a libation to the ancestors, which may or may not be sort of obvious, or you wouldn't maybe not know what that was. But probably in the entrance to an old fashioned African village, there would probably be a hut where the ancestors would be honored or consulted, like an entry point into the village. And if you had any problems with people, you'd probably have to go and resolve those issues in that small house. Yeah, the connection that you have through the ancestors is unbroken through time. The ancestors are all the people, the ones that you can remember and the ones that you can't remember. Who gets to be an ancestor is a big question, because not every human being who dies gets to be an ancestor. Ancestors are people who lived to a very old age and they died peacefully and at home, and they were properly buried. Those people get to have the spiritual authority and status of ancestorhood, and your connection to them is part of your relationship to the whole family, the whole community. So yeah, it's a spiritual connection, but it's much more practical than just, pouring out a library. How you live, who you are, what your name is, who you marry, what you're going to do, all of that is given to you by the ancestors and the spirits that live around you. So you would maybe pour out a libation on the ground, but that is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how you understand yourself and how much a part of your life the ancestors are.
Now, you talked about the spirits, and you also mentioned that this African traditional religion is not polytheistic. So how do various spirits relate to, are they kind of in Western view like angels?
I don't think that would probably be the way that people would understand them. There are lots of different kinds of spirits. There are jinn, which is an ancient Islamic term, but spirits that live in trees, in water, in certain places, and are not maligned necessarily, although they do take everything literally. So you do have to be careful what you say in terms of the jinn world, because they will hear what you're saying, but they won't discern whether it's because you want it or you don't want it. So you have to be really careful. If you say, I hope it doesn't rain, they will only hear the word rain and then they'll bring the rain. Something like that, which there are correlations between that idea in Western New Ageism and African and ATR. Only it's not a jinn, it's sort of the universe that hears what you're saying and gives you what you say without judging how you feel about it. So there are jinn, then there are spirits associated with what are called fetishes in many cultures. So a fetish would be a spirit that the owner of the fetish would put on a mask and would have some articles of power like bones or animals that had been killed or even people. And the owner of the fetish could be inhabited by a spirit for certain times and give oracles or, prophecies about what's going to happen. Every culture has just sort of a pantheon of not gods, but of spirits and kinds of spirits that are very interested in the human world and what human beings are doing. And they can be appealed to get what you want if you do it in the right way and you have someone who can help you navigate through that realm to have whatever it is that you need, or to get somebody to stop hurting you or something like that.
So one thing I think that maybe is a stereotype about African religion, at least in the West, is the idea of, African witch doctors, for example, for healing. So is that true of African traditional religions? Do Africans practice magic and witchcraft and, witch doctors to promote, physical healing?
So, yes, in a short answer, yes, there is an idea of magic, in that magic is something that can work for you. If you live in a world of unseen forces, you have to have things work to one degree or another. And you can't always know, it's not obvious why something has happened or what you should do about it. There are people who are especially skilled to know the spiritual world, and you can go to them and they will give you remedies or give you advice, usually for money, to help you navigate the world. So there are, I guess I am very shy of the word witch doctor, because it does have a particular connotation, and I don't think that that's necessarily how most people in Africa would experience this or think of it themselves. But yes, there are people who know how to handle the spirit world and make it work for you. So, and some of those people are beneficent and good and helpful, and others of those kinds of people are maybe don't have the best motivations, and so would be willing to give you some kind of medicine or some remedy to hurt somebody else, for instance, and make somebody sick or bring about a catastrophe for another person. And it is a very practical kind of art. If you have items of power, blood or bones or teeth or anything like that, or a little Quranic verse put in an amulet that you tie around a child's waist to keep them safe from the spirits. There's many different remedies, physical, seeable remedies that you can have through what we would probably call magic, although it looks very different than the magic that if you go on YouTube and start watching witches doing spells and folding paper certain ways, it's not quite the same thing. I don't know that somebody in my village, if they came here, if they were practicing ATR and were able to help people just figure out why their child was sick or something like that, and they came to America and met a so-called witch, I don't know if they would recognize each other, but maybe they would. I don't know.
So obviously, because of the unfortunate existence of the slave trade over centuries, there is a huge African diaspora all around the world and in the West. And so as a result of that, has African traditional religion as it's practiced in Africa, has it made it to the West in various different ways? Has it been retained pretty much? Do you see people in the West trying to pursue ATR because Western religions like Christianity, for example, had supplanted the ATR that was practiced by the diaspora once they came to the West?
I think this is one of the most interesting reasons to study ATR right now. I think Christians should really know about ATR as it exists on the continent of Africa and how people still think about it and live as African traditionalists. But yes, well, first of all, there's a lot of conversation between, there's many people in America who are from Africa who live here now in recent terms, not through slavery or anything, but through immigration. And then there's a sense of disillusionment in our culture now as the descendants of slaves whose families might be sort of Christian to one degree or another are disillusioned with what Christianity has offered them and are on purpose going back and considering ATR in a fresh way. So not sort of through the more common ways of like voodoo and some of the marriage between Catholicism through much of Central America and South America and ATR. There's a very interesting marriage between those two religions. But a sort of a new version of it, I've seen more and more as people have in the US who have never lived in Africa, but whose ancestors did, are going back and trying to find and revive for themselves a more true version of ATR that's not is historically the same. So it's a fascinating world to be in or to study, and I encourage you. So if you've run across BLM, Black Lives Matter, some of the people in BLM are consciously using ATR from the continent of Africa to think about their ancestors, to think about the way that they live, to think about police violence and so on. And it's interesting to me because I think they feel that that's a birthright, and it may be, but I don't think that they have the categories, the philosophical categories. It's not a one-for-one correspondence between an American who's grown up in America and a person who lives in Nigeria and how they're viewing the spirit world. But I think that there's a sense that maybe they are, and so it's fine just to move from one to the other without any problem.
One thing that has pretty much been very prolific in the African continent when we talk about Christianity is the word of faith movement and the prosperity gospel. It's taken root there. It's been very popular as a Christian expression in Africa. So, do you see any kind of crossover between ATR and the prosperity gospel, both in Africa and in the West?
This is a new field of study that really should be. I know people are beginning to study it, and there's been some really interesting writing on this subject, but there is a very interesting entrance point for the prosperity gospel and for ATR. And the prosperity gospel is just exploding across Africa. It's like a pandemic of the prosperity gospel. And it is true because there are categories that seem to fit very easily together. So in the word of faith movement, what you say has the power to bring into being something real. And because that's true in many African cultures, because people believe that the spirits are listening and have power, you should be careful what you say out loud when they come up against a prosperity or word of faith idea. They understand it very well. It has emotional resonance, spiritual resonance. Of course, you should be careful what you say. You shouldn't say, I hope I don't get sick, because you will get sick if you do that. So there's an easy entry point or an easy marriage between the prosperity gospel and ATR. And I think there's a conversation back and forth across the continent. You know, America has also a prosperity pandemic going on, and the two can be given back and forth to each other and shape the way people think without pausing to consider if that's really what you want or that's really how you should conceive of God. And I think many denominations around Africa are struggling with prosperity teaching creeping in and not knowing how to combat it because of its similarity to ATR in many situations. And I think that has contributed to why in the US as well, people could go easily through the word of faith movement and leave Christianity and go into something like ATR or some other kind of religious system because it seems to fit so comfortably and make so much sense.
So, given all of that, I mean, you know, their idea that, okay, God could exist and so forth. I mean, just generally, you know, with religion in Africa, how does somebody really talk to an adherent of ATR about the gospel? Or probably more common for us in the United States or in the West, people who are dabbling into saying, well, Christianity isn't sufficient. I would like to go back to the religion of my ancestors.
Well, I think one thing that has been very tragic about American Christianity over the last century is the Enlightenment idea that the spiritual realm is, if you can't see it, you can't know it. The privileging of empirical knowledge through science over everything else, which has been wonderful in terms of science and getting to have, you know, such a high standard of living, and so, especially in a time of illness, science comes quickly to the aid and you can fix problems scientifically. But that has led the Western mind to believe that if you can't see it, it must not really be there, and to discount utterly the spiritual realm and to disbelieve that God and that the spiritual forces of darkness might be real and might have power in some sense. So I think as Christians, as we find that our culture is more and more pluralistic, religiously diverse, and that things like ATR are coming in and becoming mainstream, the first thing to do would be to stop saying that there are no spirits or that there's nothing that has power besides the workings of your own mind. The spiritual realm is real. The scripture tells us that it is, and that if you don't bring all things in subjection under Christ, you're going to be battling with things that have ideas of their own. So the first thing to do is, I think, to repent of that and say, when somebody says, I'm sacrificing to a spirit, or I know that I'm pouring out a libation to my ancestors on the ground, to say, well, that's not real. You shouldn't do that. I think the first thing to do would be to listen and try to understand what their view of God is and why are they doing that. Because there are underlying logical reasons for all religious behavior. And so trying to tease those out first would be really helpful in an evangelistic situation. And then I would, as part of my listening, want to try to understand what they think of how can the human person be related to God? Because another big critique of the West is the individualism that we suffer under. We are actually connected to people deeply in ways that we can't really understand and can't properly describe. And so when my, neighbor, who I don't really know, decides to get up and move away and go somewhere else, that has a sort of a spiritual effect. That individualism has a spiritual consequence for the whole community that we don't think about enough. We don't understand it. We're not curious about it. So I would start there. There's a community of people, human people, that need to be related to God. And though your own salvation deeply matters and God can save you out of the pit that you've dug for yourself through the blood of his son, he would like to do it in a way that connects you back to all the people that he has made, and not in a way that divides you eternally from them. So I think we could be more interested in what the person who believes in ATR is really thinking about God and humanity, and then struggle to use our own way of preaching the gospel to work itself out in those kinds of categories, because the gospel is for every culture, even for the person who believes in the ancestors. We don't have ancestors, but we do have the saints who have gone before us, and we have a spiritual connection to them, and we are related to them eternally. There's a lot of parts of the Christian life, I think, that we have abandoned or haven't thought about it at all because we haven't needed to think that way. And that would be my first thought.
Well, finally, on a much lighter note, to get to know our authors a little bit better, I have some fun rapid fire questions for Anne. So, Anne, it's officially fall now. It's October. Are you a fan of all things pumpkin?
I do like to make a pumpkin pie, 1 or 2 pumpkin pies, but I'm really more a fan of the apples of autumn and picking apples and making pie out of apples.
And besides theology and religion, what do you know well enough to teach other people?
Oh, goodness. Well, I do a very good pie crust. I could teach people how to make pie.
Well, that sounds delicious. Thanks, Anne, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
You've been listening to episode 258 of the Postmodern Realities podcast. Today's guest was Anne Kennedy. We talked about African traditional religion, and she's written a feature article for us about that subject in volume 44, number 3 of the print issue. This article, African Traditional Religion, Black Lives Matter, and the Prosperity Gospel, is also available for our subscribers to read for free at equip.org. If you would like to read her article and are not yet a subscriber, please head on over to equip.org to subscribe. We'd like to connect to you, so please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man YouTube channel and join in the conversation in the comments section and in the live chat when we have premiere videos. Please follow the Bible Answer Man page on Facebook, and on Twitter you will find us at Hank Hanegraaff, Bible Answer Man, Christian Research Institute, and Christian Research Journal, as well as on Instagram at the Bible Answer Man account. You won't want to miss every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern when we live stream the Bible Answer Man broadcast, hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff at our website, equip.org. In addition, please subscribe to the Hank Unplugged podcast. Hank gets out of the studio and into his study and engages in in-depth, free-flowing, essential Christian conversations on critical issues with some of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people on the planet. You'll want to head on over to equip.org because there you're going to find thousands of free resources for you in articles and past broadcasts, our podcasts, and videos. And thank you for all the ways in which you partner with the Christian Research Institute.